Okay, so I'm back with another critique video. A couple of my patrons submitted their artwork over on Patreon for me to take a look at, and before we get into it, again, I just have to preface everything by saying that I'm not a professional. I've never worked in the art industry, I've never filled out a W-2 to draw anything. I'm just a guy on the internet who likes to draw and occasionally give advice. So now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at our first submission by one Epitome Frost. And Frost says, I drew out a little sketch of what I wanted my picture to look like. Is there any way I can improve upon it and make it look more dynamic? So after looking at this drawing and reading your inquiry for the first time, Frost, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that before I say anything at all, we need to ask ourselves, what does it really mean to draw dynamically? What makes a drawing dynamic? And the answer to that question could be many things actually, but for me, I think the first answer to that question is that a dynamic drawing is one that portrays the subject being drawn in motion. This is why for me, whenever I'm figure drawing, I always like to draw the figure as if it was in the middle of a movement. So like jumping, dancing, punching or kicking, and stuff like that. So for example, a pose like the one I'm drawing now is something that could be considered a dynamic pose in that this pose is portraying a character in the middle of a movement, almost as if I took a picture of this character right in the middle of him jumping in the air. However, a dynamic figure drawing doesn't always have to be of a character in the middle of a movement. You can also draw a figure at the end of a movement in order to describe a character that just moved, as opposed to drawing a figure as it's still moving. And so the character that I'm drawing now is portraying a figure at the end of a movement, which in this case is like a downward slash with a weapon of some sort. Something like this can be further emphasized by adding motion lines like this one here in order to describe the arc of the movement that's taking place. This is something of course that is used all the time in comics and manga in order to describe a character at the end of a movement, like with the Joker here punching Batman in the face. This arc here is describing the path of the movement, and it may help in making the drawing as a whole more dynamic. And with this panel of a Batman punching Joker, these two poses are good examples of both a character at the end of a movement, like with Batman here, and of a character who's in the middle of a movement, like with Joker flying through the air. Another way you can spice up a drawing, I think, is by simply changing the camera angle. So like with this drawing here, on its own, it can be described as dynamic, but the camera angle you can say is pretty neutral. It's not high or low necessarily, it just looks pretty square. So by using the same pose, but giving it a lower angle could make the overall image just a tad more dynamic, as now the angle itself has moved from its neutral position to a more dynamic angle. This is basically the same principle as with this example of this drawing of a character giving a thumbs up. On its own, this drawing isn't very dynamic in that there isn't any motion that's necessarily being described here. It's a pretty static pose, and the camera angle is also at eye level, so it's all pretty square and neutral. Whereas if I keep the same pose but bring the camera a bit higher, even though there still isn't any movement being described, the shift in the camera angle makes what would otherwise be a pretty boring pose a more dynamic looking pose just by changing that angle. And again, here's the same pose but with a lower camera angle, and hopefully you'll agree that it just makes for a more interesting image overall than it was previously with a neutral camera angle. So in these two cases, the pose is static and the camera angle is what's dynamic. In other words, the angle is what's moving, not the character. So Frost, I think this could possibly be something you can implement to make the overall drawing more dynamic if you feel like the angle of your original drawing is too square to you. And this is a pretty rough looking example. There's probably like all sorts of perspective problems here, but nonetheless, I hope you're catching my drift anyway. Now, another way I like to draw in dynamic figures is by implementing the anticipation of a movement. So first we had a character in the middle of a movement, a character at the end of a movement, and now we have a character that is about to move. So for example, in this path of movement described by these drawings, the anticipation frame would of course be this one here because it's portraying a character that is about to jump, as opposed to these drawings which portray the character in the middle of the jump. So with this figure that I'm drawing now, it's describing a character that is about to punch you in the face. So because it is describing a motion that is about to happen, it can make for a more dynamic looking pose. Another example with this drawing is, if this is the key pose to a path of movement, I'd have to draw the anticipation of this key pose, as well as the movement taking place, and then the key pose would be the end of the movement. So with these three drawings, the anticipation would of course be the first drawing, the middle one is the movement as it's happening, and the last one is the end of the movement, which is the key pose. And the point of all this is just to say that all three of these drawings can each be described as dynamic on their own, and so by thinking of any one of these stages in a path of movement can help you when you're trying to think about a dynamic pose or what that would look like. So Frost, when it comes to your drawing, I think anticipation is also something that you can implement to perhaps make a more dynamic drawing. For example, your drawing on the left can possibly be seen as describing a still pose, and the one on the right is describing a pose in anticipation of a movement, like a slash of a sword or an axe. But of course, it's not absolutely necessary to draw your character like the one on the right if that's not what you're going for. If you're going for more of a still pose, your original drawing, Frost, I think is plenty sufficient for that purpose. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that movement doesn't necessarily need to be applied to the entire body of a figure to make a drawing dynamic. For example, we have a character here with long hair in a pretty static pose. Nothing is moving in this drawing, the camera angle is also neutral, so this drawing on its own isn't very dynamic looking. However, if I draw this character in the same pose and the same angle, but draw the hair moving, all of a sudden this very static pose is not so static anymore because there is now movement happening within the drawing. And so comparatively, the one on the right is just inherently more dynamic, if only a tiny bit more so. The same can be said if I have a character with a cape, for example, where the cape is just falling straight down and isn't being affected by anything other than gravity. This on its own is a static pose. But if I take the same guy and draw the cape moving and flapping in the wind, that drawing is inherently more dynamic than the first one, despite being the same pose otherwise. The cape is what's moving, not the character, and so that is something you can think about when trying to make a drawing more dynamic. So Frost, I think with this pose, you can maybe play around with how the fur on the character's jacket moves in the wind, or even play with the jacket itself, maybe also being affected by wind or something of that nature. And with all that, those are a few ways that you can make this drawing more dynamic, Frost, and it is still in a rough stage, which should give you lots of opportunities to switch up anything you like to experiment with. So thanks so much for your submission and for your support on Patreon, and I hope I was able to help you out a little bit. So the next submission I received is from Cookie over on Patreon, and Cookie says, "Hi, I'm new here and these are some of the gesture drawings that I did, and I'm really new to everything, so I need guidance on what I should be practicing and forcing my attention on." And to be perfectly honest, Cookie, your submission gave me quite a hard time in that I was trying to force myself to look at what's wrong with your drawings in order to be able to tell you what it is that you need to work on. However, I feel in this case that it would be better for me to tell you what you did right with these drawings, as I feel like telling you what you did well is equally as important as telling you what you did wrong. And this is especially the case with a gesture drawing because the whole point of a gesture drawing is simply to capture the essence of a subject in a quick and simplified sketch. And because of that, Cookie, I feel like you've nailed these gesture drawings, and so I want to focus on a few things here that you did that I really like that you actually might not have even been privy to the fact that you were doing these things. Starting with this drawing here, and specifically with the legs, I can see that you didn't complete the form of the legs here and chose to omit the lines that would have completed those forms, and this is one instance actually where less is more and works in this case because even though the legs aren't filled in all the way, we still know looking at it that those are indeed the figure's legs, and it's instantly recognizable, and because of that, it succeeds entirely as a gesture drawing. And even with this drawing on the right, I really like how you've described the leg folding over by using this floating hook line in the middle here, which of course is describing the calf of the reference. And this is another case where drawing the rest of that leg, in my opinion, is unnecessary as the hook line alone gives the viewer just enough information to imagine the position of that leg for themselves. And you'll see that if I erased the hook, for the most part, the pose is still readable, but by adding just that one line, it leaves no question, in my opinion, what position the leg is in, and so that's another instance where less is more. Because what you could have done was looked at the reference and found all these lines on the model to further describe the form in your drawing, which yes can possibly give the pose more readability with all that new information, but you'll find that it's ultimately unnecessary as the pose is still recognizable even without all of those added lines. And with this one, I mean, this is just another great gesture drawing. I love how you describe the entire left side of the torso with one big C curve that works really well even on top of the reference. But with the right side, and this is maybe the first real critique slash suggestion that I'll give you, is that I can see that you used 4 separate lines to describe the right side of this drawing. One here, this little one, and then one for the hip, and then one for the leg. And my suggestion is that instead of using 4 separate lines, you could have actually just used one line to describe that part of the body with a simple S curve, and that would have portrayed the exact same amount of information as with 4 lines. The form that's being described is the same. And the reason why I said critique slash suggestion is because really the amount of lines that you use in a gesture drawing isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. However, by making a conscious effort to use less lines, it's a great way to train your mind to see complex forms and describe a lot of information with as little as possible. So for example, I'm going to do a quick gesture drawing and I'm going to use only 3 lines to describe the torso and the legs. So here's the head, which also is 1 line, and then the torso, which is only 1 line again, and see how I was able to describe nearly the entire position and the angle of the torso with just that 1 line alone. And there's 1 line for the leg, which I promise is 1 line. I know my cursor kind of went off the screen there, but my pen never actually lifted off the screen. And the same with the other leg, which makes 4 lines total for this entire drawing so far. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here, Cookie, is that in the same amount of lines that you use to describe just one side of the body of a figure, I was able to use to describe nearly the entire body of a figure. And from there I can just use however many lines to complete the gesture, but ultimately the point here is that, again, making a conscious effort to use the least amount of lines possible will help you improve your economy of lines by reinforcing the idea that less is more. But so despite even that, the pose itself is absolutely readable and captures the entire essence of the model, which is why this too is a successful gesture drawing. And with this last one, I really don't have notes for this either, other than what I said just now. For example, you can use just 2 lines to describe the rhythm of the torso here, as opposed to 3 or maybe even more, considering that it looks as though you were going over the same line multiple times on this side, which typically could be a sign of a lack of confidence in your line work, as though you were just putting down lines in hopes that you find the right looking one, as opposed to saying definitively, this is the line that I'm going to use. And with this left side, you could even extend that 1 line and go all the way down to the foot, and I think this could work well too. But all in all, again, the pose nonetheless is instantly readable, and because of that, this too is a successful gesture drawing. So Cookie, the reason why all of your drawings are good gesture drawings is because what's important in a gesture drawing isn't in the details, but in how clear and effective you're able to capture a pose. So when in doubt, just ask yourself, Is the pose immediately readable? If the answer is yes, then you've successfully created a good gesture drawing, and it doesn't matter how many lines you used or if you took 3 minutes or 3 seconds. If you can tell what the pose is, take the W and move on to the next one. So thank you for your submission, Cookie, and thanks for your support on Patreon, and I hope that I was able to help you. And with that, that is going to be the end of this video, and as always, I'd like to thank all of my patrons for their support over on Patreon, for without them, I'd be homeless and starve. And if you'd like me to critique your artwork, consider supporting me on Patreon as well. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you again as soon as possible.